when we look at, earlier iterations of the dancing plague and the way that it's experienced as a group mania. Mm-hmm. Right? So this is something that a huge group of people does. You're all carried away. You begin to do this. And, some people just follow it because they're like, my wife, and then and you've got to kind of go along to make sure that she doesn't, maim herself or something like that.
I mean, that's how most men get to the dance floor, right?
Yeah, I know, right?
Hi everyone, Maddy here. I'm just jumping in to let you know that in this episode, we are going to be talking about historic infanticide. Eleanor, first of all, welcome to After Dark.
Thank you so much for having me on here and realizing me as a kindred spooky person.
Absolutely.
So this is important to me.
We had to have you on.
Exactly.
But hold on, this isn't even the most important thing that we've just discovered. So Eleanor and I have just met for the first time, despite both having History Hub podcasts. And we were just, where are you from? Where are you from? The usual thing we do with guests. And we are from, originally, the very same smattering of fields in County Kilkenny in Ireland.
That's right.
That is insane. I don't meet people who are from there. People are not really from there. There's only hundreds of us.
Yeah, and we are in fact related, and this probably explains why we're both spooky people.
Yeah, well, I have said this on this podcast before.
Mm-hmm.
Kilkenny, Chatsworth Clock, where I live. Shout out to Chatsworth.
Shout out Chatsworth.
History Hit
Yes.
podcast. That is where I think that formative spookiness came from. I've said this before, so I hear you on that one. But listen, that's not what we're here to talk about, although we could a whole 30 minutes on that. We're here to talk about medieval dancing plagues. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, well, first of all, they're great. And I want to make that absolutely and abundantly clear. And the thing that's interesting about them is that there's a few of them. You would kind of think that one dancing plague would be enough.
I would think that.
But medieval people, no. They go for it time and again. But also one thing that we have to talk about here is this seems to be something for German people.
Okay.
And more particularly, it's a special treat for German people who live kind of like in the Rhine area.
Interesting.
So this is a sort of place where it crops up time and again. Now, having said that, there is a fairly similar phenomena that happens in the Italian lands, but they more specifically say that it has to do with getting bitten by a spider or a lizard. And they call it like a tarantulism. So,
that's an origin story waiting to happen.
Yeah,
that's superhero stuff, right?
Exactly. And they're like, oh yeah, you get bit by a spider, you dance, normal. So it's less of a plague because it's more like saying there's something venomous happens to you and you dance. But one of the really, really big ones that starts happening happens in 1374, and we refer to it more specifically as the St. John's dance. And it breaks out in Aachen, which, real heads will remember as Charlemagne's capital, from 600 years before then, or whatever, but fine. And all these people just kind of show up from different places, and they are dancing, and not in like we're having a very nice and fun way. They're dancing rather maniacally, usually yelling and screaming, sometimes saying that they are seeing themselves as being in a river of blood, oftentimes jumping over things repeatedly. So like jumping over walls or other people or anything that kind of gets in their way because they experience these things as obstacles. And they are yelling about demons and how they're being tortured and how they can't stop dancing, even if they wish to do so. And they're wearing bandages kind of around their wrists and things like this. And they'll dance and they'll dance and they'll dance. And then they'll kind of fall down onto the ground. And someone will come around with a stick and sort of twist the bandages that are around their limbs and often around their middle tighter, which seems to give them some kind of relief from whatever it is that they're suffering. Sometimes that escalates to just beating them.
Interesting.
Question mark. And often they are said to have distended stomachs. So like their stomachs are really bloated and distended, and they talk about that, and they talk about that being uncomfortable. The reason that this is often called St. John's dance is it generally takes place around in June, which is when you have a lot of the feast day celebrations for St. John the Baptist. And Victorians, surprise, got a bit weird about this. And Victorians, what they like to say about this is, oh, well, St. John's celebrations were a takeover from pagan traditions where you'd burn trees, and then people started doing that with St. John the Baptist. So really they're enacting some pagan ritual. This is a Victorian nonsense. Victorians, what they want to do is say that something medieval people did is like a pagan holdover. And I'm like, that's a hell of a hangover. Like that's like 900 years
later, yeah.
By the time you get to the 14th century. So it seems odd, right? But it is experienced by everyone as like a very kind of distressing thing. So, and it starts off in the German lands, right? And then they kind of move into the Netherlands. So they show up at Liège. They show up in Utrecht.
Are these the same people?
Oftentimes, yeah. So they kind of show up and it begins to snowball.
Okay, so I'm going to be the suspicious person
Yeah,
in this
yeah, yeah.
episode.
No,
This is usually Anthony's role. He doesn't buy anything that I ever say, and he makes
No,
me
it's not
work
just
for
you.
it.
It's just everyone.
He makes me work for it. Okay, so these people, they're dancing in a way that seems chaotic. They're moving erratically, but there's obviously some choreography going on in that they're all claiming to see and experience the same things. Their bodies are decorated in these weird ways with these weird ties, and they're the same people or the same kinds of communities that are turning up all over Europe, and it's spreading. This is suspicious. Is there a motive for this, do we think?
So, I mean, what it seems like to me, one of the motives is, I got that dancing plague. I gotta go to Utrecht, and which, so one thing that is written about it is says thus. Peasants left their plows, mechanics their workshops, housewives their domestic duties to join the wild revels. And this rich commercial city, which Utrecht, became the scene of the most ruinous disorder. Secret desires were excited, but too often found opportunities for wild enjoyment. And numerous beggars, stimulated by vice and misery, availed themselves of this new complaint to gain a temporary livelihood. Girls and boys quitted their parents, and servants their masters, to amuse themselves at the dance of those possessed, and greedily imbibed the poison of mental infection. Above 100 unmarried women were seen raving about in consecrated and unconsecrated places, and the consequences were soon perceived. Gangs of idle vagabonds who understood how to imitate the life and the gestures and convulsions of those really affected roved from place to place seeking maintenance and adventures, and thus, wherever they went, spreading this disgusting spasmodic disease like a plague. For in maladies of this kind, the susceptible are infected as easily by the appearance as by the reality.
So many things to say here. So it's an opportunity to step out of your normal experience. If you are lacking power in some way, if you're a vagabond, as quoted in that text, if you are an unmarried woman or a housewife or someone labouring in the field, you get to step out of your life and do something a little bit different. The mention of the plague there. Now, we don't necessarily think of dancing as something viral outside of the internet. I'm down with the kids.
We've all seen TikTok. Yes, we do.
It's on the TikToks, guys. But there's this idea that it's spreading, and of course, plague is a real, very virulent thing in the medieval world, and is a genuine threat and does spread. So, is this something that's seen like? I mean, obviously, they don't understand it in terms of a virus, but is it seen like another kind of plague? Yeah,
because what they kind of have a concept of, I think that we could say, is what we would call social contagion. And they're really clear on that. So, for example, medieval people are really clear on the idea that if you see people behaving badly, whatever that might mean, it can spread just because it's sort of influential. We see this, for example, in the way that sex work is mediated. It's something that you have to do in order to keep the spread of violence and the contagion of that down, but you also have to keep it in particular places so that it doesn't spread. There is a real idea that practice or action is something that will spur other people to action. So, yeah, absolutely, there is this idea that you can kind of be pricked into these certain things. And, I think also with one of the things we have to say, especially about the St. John's dance, is where it kind of starts off along the Rhine, they just come out of a really, really devastating flood. So really terrible. There was a huge loss of life. It ruined crops. So they were having a really tough time. In a tough the 14th century noted like probably the toughest century I think that we could say that. So, you're kind of like 40 years on from the Black Death. There are still plague recurrences over and over every few years. Now you've got this devastating flood, and people are just a little bit freaked out. And so the idea that you can kind of act out a little bit might be very, very kind of pleasant for them, I would say.
I guess if you're a labourer in the field and your field's been flooded and you have no crops to labour over, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Go dancing.
Exactly. And, it is
That's
a way.
what I do.
I mean, it's just like when times are tough, baby.
Absolutely. It's the answer.
So this is all happening, right? So we have these dancing people, and they're potentially traveling, and they're going from different areas to different places, which I didn't know, by the way. So that's really interesting that there's potentially some of the same people turning up in some of these same different areas. How did they get it under control then, in this particular instance?
In this particular instance, we go straight to exorcisms.
Obviously.
Needless to say.
Clearly. So it's very much experienced by the people who are looking at it as this is demonic in character.
Okay.
So, again, the idea of contagion really kind of works there. And people are saying that, they're insensible. They're just screaming. They talk about how they're being plagued by demons. They talk about rivers of blood. They're asking the Virgin Mary and Jesus for help. So the clergy show up and they're like, all right. Okay, that is it. And they do say that they experience this to be fairly effective on a number of occasions. So basically the clergy just herd them kind of towards churches, and like one by one, they're kind of like, here you go. And people go, oh, right, yeah.
Wow.
They kind of get up and they're like, yes, this is fine.
Back to the fields.
Yeah, exactly. And then you're like, oh, back to the fields. Well, here I am in, Metz. I'm from Aachen, so it's going to take a little while to get back there. So you get kind of this experience with that. So there is very much this understanding that it can be controlled by means of divine intercession. So they're experiencing it as supernatural, very specifically in character at the time for the 14th century plague. But the thing is, these does come back again. So,
Amazing.
And more particularly in the 15th century. So you get to 1418, and then we hit the St. Vitus dance.
This is the one people have probably heard a little bit about.
And this happens in Strasbourg. And Strasbourg is a real epicenter for dancing plagues. They just love it in Strasbourg. Can't get enough. They do it again in 1518 as well.
Why?
My personal opinion on this is they understand it as something that can happen. So it happens.
Yes.
It's a part of the cultural memory. It's a part of, understanding that this is something that can break out. And so they're like, all right, it's happening again, right? Yeah. And that one, the 1518 one, this is the one where if you look up dancing plagues online, you'll see kind of like engravings and stuff.
Okay, so why is this one the big one that we remember?
So this one is absolutely huge. And you just get a lot more people involved. And it becomes a bit more violent than did the St. Vitus dances. The St. John's dances. This is the St. Vitus dance. And so we've got this description thus, which is, the dancers' fury and extravagance of demeanor so completely deprived them of their senses that many of them dashed their brains out against the walls and corners of buildings, or rushed headlong into rapid rivers where they found a watery grave. Roaring and foaming as they were, the bystanders could only succeed in restraining them by placing benches and chairs in their way, so that, by the high leaps they were thus tempted to take, their strength might be exhausted. As soon as this was the case, they fell as if they were lifeless to the ground, and by very slow degrees again recovered their strength. Many there were who, even with all this exertion, had not yet expanded the violence of the tempest which raged within them, but awoke with newly revived powers, and again mixed with the crowd of dancers, until at length the violent excitement of their disordered nerves was allayed by the general and great involuntary exertion of their limbs, and the mental disorder was calmed by the extreme exhaustion of the body.
Wow.
So this is, the St. John's dance was a bit, well, this is odd. These people are experiencing themselves as being possessed. They're in distress. We can certainly say that they're in distress, but they're not killing themselves.
Yeah.
They're not falling into rivers. So this is much more, it kind of strikes me a bit almost like zombie movies or something where it's like, you just have a bunch of people and then they begin to act very violently and erratically.
And again, that idea of virus spreading as well.
Because we are now in the world of illness. however you wanted. I mean, you could have said that about the St. John's, obviously, but we're now talking about people who are so distressed that they are potentially taking their own lives, which is...
En masse as well. Like, this is mass hysteria, something psychological across a group of people is happening here.
And we are left with some depictions of this dancing, particularly for the St. Vitus curse. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So by the 16th century, we have a few engravings of this, and they're quite interesting. You know, if you're a fan of kind of early modern, late medieval painting, which I am, it looks like a Bruegel, or it looks like, you know, these kind of depictions of dancing that you would see of peasants at a wedding, and they're kind of shaking though, and they seem really in distress, and you've got neighbors sort of grabbing them and being like, no, don't do it. Don't go and get dancing mania. So you can see that they're really very particularly in distress. But this is something that was notable enough that artists were saying, we need to make a rendering of this. We need to kind of like get it on record that this had happened.
And I love the idea of neighbours trying to pull them back. And that they thought that was worthwhile recording, that the neighbours were trying to pull them back.
And they're taking this visual language of the, you know, the sort of medieval, late medieval, bucolic art language, and they're making it horrific in some way. It's a sort of transformation of the art as well as the people and their bodies. Yeah,
and you know, I think that it's really important sometimes to kind of have a look at these things, because when we see it, we can just kind of say, oh, it's a little bit jolly, you know, dancing, like, oh, it's silly. But, you know, they are experiencing it as traumatic in a lot of cases.
And I'm assuming now, based on what you've told us previously, that there may have been some kind of social, cultural, religious pressure on the community that enacted this. Would that be correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because here we also have the explanations change very slightly. So before, where we see kind of ideas that this is demoniac in character, that this is something that is affected very specifically by you know, demons, and you can just ask for the intercession of God, and that'll be fine. Here, interestingly, they come up with the idea that they have been cursed by, very specifically, Saint Vitus, which is why we call this the Saint Vitus plague. And this is odd because Saint Vitus, he's one of these saints where
Never heard of him.
Yeah, like, I mean, that's a saint.
Yeah.
So he's big in the German lands because someone went down to Sicily and got his body at a point in time and brought him back. And he's also like one of the founding saints of the Prague Cathedral.
Oh, yeah.
Because St. Wenceslas got hold of his arm.
Right.
So it's St. Vitus and St. Wenceslas, you know, cathedral. And everyone forgets the St. Vitus part because who? And we don't know anything about him. He's just one of those like really late antique, like,
he's not even on social media.
No profile whatsoever.
For medieval people in the German lands, they've got his body parts, and so that is a really compelling reason to worship him. So he begins to be referred to as one of the heavenly helpers. It's kind of like this German thing. So they're like, oh yeah, he's a guy that you can ask to for help. And they decide that he's cursing people partially because one of the ways that they try to control the people who have this dancing mania is they kind of drag them into this one chapel that's nearby, and it happens to be a chapel of St. Vitus. And they get in there, and it's like, oh, I'm not dancing anymore. So there's this understanding or a kind of connection between St. Vitus stopping this that is created in people's minds. And then they decide, oh, St. Vitus has cursed us for... you know, question mark. Standard late medieval reasons. You're probably too sexy, too into food, too lazy.
What do you mean too sexy?
I mean, like God is constantly mad at medieval people in the late medieval period for being too sexy.
I wish I had that problem.
I know. Well, you know, it's a curse. What can I say?
Poor you, Eleanor.
Yeah, I know. It's really terrible. But yeah, so it's quite interesting though, because this one becomes a real template, and very interestingly, it's something that even when dancing plays begin to peter out, so in sort of the 16th and 17th century, for example, there are references to women who they're like, oh, well, I just proactively every year get down to the St. Vitus Chapel because I know I'm going to get hit with a dancing plague. And then they dance around, you know, they freak out for a while. Then they kind of go into the chapel, at which point they calm down and they report feeling much better. And
so
I'm like,
therapy.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's kind of like, oh, this is their week a year where they go freak out dancing.
Yeah.
And then they feel really, you know, expunged of this.
I wonder if it's something to do with sort of autonomy over your own body. If we're thinking about this as something that's affecting people who traditionally don't have much power in these societies, that this gives them an opportunity to kind of hand their power over to something else that isn't tangible necessarily, something that can take over their bodies, and they're not responsible for anything. But it's not the society around them that's controlling them. It's something else, and maybe that's therapeutic to them. It's an escape of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, I would especially believe that to be true. You know, when we look at, for example, the St. John's plague, and they're like, oh, and these housewives, and it's like, yeah, you know, oh, well, there's nothing you can do. You can't drag me back to the kitchen and tell me to kind of look after babies. You know, unmarried women, this is a chance to socialize.
Yes.
Without, you know, having everyone in your business calling you a slut. Yeah. You know,
and to be out of the house, to literally be out of the space that you spend all of your life in.
Exactly.
And your village that you may never have had any idea of leaving prior to this.
I mean, making it from Aachen all the way to Utrecht, that's a really big deal. Yeah. Like getting to see like Liège, like, you know, and you're now suddenly you're up in Belgium or something, you know, and saying, oh, well, I couldn't help it. There's nothing I can do. You know, what's your master going to do if you're a serf?
Yeah.
Right? Like you can't get in trouble if you've got the dancing plague. Right? So there are all these interesting ways of kind of acting it out. And when it happens again, kind of in the 16th century, really interestingly, we see this new approach to it from particularly people of medicine. And so we have some great stuff from the 16th century Swiss physician called Paracelsus. And he says about it, it is abundantly not a curse from a saint. And he says, quote, "We will not, however, admit that the saints have the power to inflict diseases, and that these ought to be named after them, although many there are who, in their theology, lay great stress on this supposition, ascribing them rather to God than to nature, which is but idle talk. We dislike such nonsensical gossip as it is supported by symptoms, but only by faith, a thing which is not human, whereon the gods themselves set no value." So you do begin to have this new way of like thinking in the modern period where it's like, come on now.
Yeah, it's a total shift, isn't it?
Yeah.
From God and the church having power to say, this is the saint who's doing it, and now it's suddenly, guys, maybe we need to look at the medical situation, you know, what's going on.
And it's really interesting because when he looks at it, he says that we can class people who are affected by the dancing plague in 3 different ways. So he says that the dancing plague can arrive from the imagination. It can also come from sensual desires, depending on the will. And also it could come from corporeal causes.
Okay, so psychological or something physical is happening. I mean, it's quite logical.
He's also covering a lot of bases there, right? It's like, it could literally be all of
anything.
These things.
Yeah.
And so he also at the same time says, and then you treat it accordingly. So if it's someone who is affected by the imagination, he's got this really great, very psychological way of treating it, where he says he has the person affected make a wax model of themselves.
Stop. That's incredible.
Yeah, exactly right.
Do any of these models survive?
No, because
that would be amazing.
What you do is you make the model and you think really hard on, you know, the way that you are being affected by this particular outbreak of the dancing plague, and you put it together and then you burn it.
You see, this is a form of wellness, mental health, the administration of some kind of healing around mental health. I'm using contemporary terminology, but it's asking you to reflect on yourself. It's asking you to self-correct. Self-correct, by the way, not the church intervening.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting way about going about doing
to make a physical manifestation of this other version of you that's stepped outside your life, that's having this adventure, and you have to, at the end of your time enjoying yourself, you have to destroy it. You have to put it back.
Which, by the way, they wouldn't really have had. These people who are mostly suffering from this wouldn't have been having sculptures made of them, wouldn't have been appearing in paintings. So the depiction of themselves, even in rudimentary form,
as a self-portrait as well. It's self-reflection and self-portrayal, I guess.
Sorry, we got carried away with that, but that is interesting.
It's really interesting too, because especially when we look at, you know, earlier iterations of the dancing plague and the way that it's experienced as a group mania. Right. So this is something that a huge group of people does. You're all carried away. You begin to do this. And, you know, some people are carried away by it. Some people just follow it because they're like, my wife, you know, and then and you've got to kind of like go around along to make sure that she doesn't, you know, maim herself or something like that.
I mean, that's how most men get to the dance floor, right?
Yeah, I know, right? So, you know, and here, this is kind of really individualizing. It's saying, no, you've kind of got the power to be treated with this. For people who are then, you know, they're saying you're doing this because you've got sensual desires, then it's sort of like, you know, maybe you should seek confession or something like that. It becomes
Take 5. Think about what you've done.
The 16th century is only so enlightened. I think everyone wants to go like, oh, and in the Renaissance, then suddenly, and I'm like, no, it was still hyper religious. It's sometimes even more so. So there is still kind of thing there, and then there is an understanding that it might be physical in some senses. And it's interesting because some of the treatments that we see even earlier, when, their exorcism is sort of like the big one, but also there'll be things that are like, well, get some bagpipes in here. It's always bagpipes. They're like, we're gonna do more music, because what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of like draw this out of people, and they get excited by more dancing. So if you give them some music to go with it, they'll be like, all right, well, these people are just going to exhaust themselves, and kind of like treating it like maybe it is physical. It's a physical ailment. So if we're just like, let's just chop, make with the dance and fall down and like, let's get this out of your system. Okay, now you're tired. So sometimes the way that they look at it is like, this is physical, but all that we can really do is
go with it.
To quote P-Funk, we've got to get over the hump, Like you just got to like bring it up and like get it through.
But bagpipes in the medieval world, do they have any particular religious significance? Are they used in battle? Are they relevant to how people are viewing this hysteria?
Interestingly, it's a big party time instrument, but also it's experienced much in the way that bagpipes are now, which is like they're kind of a bit much. So, for example, like when you see like hell scenes, and Hieronymus Bosch does this. So Hieronymus Bosch, when he includes instruments in hell scenes, it's either a hurdy-gurdy or it is a bagpipe.
Not the hurdy-gurdy. I am here for the hurdy-gurdy.
Yeah, I have to say I quite like the bagpipes.
I like both.
From a distance.
They're noisy, right? I mean, I think that kind of people experience it as this.
They're shocking. They're quite. It's a good way of shocking you out of yourself, I guess.
That's so interesting that they're associated with hell as well. I didn't know that.
Are they in some way enchanting? I'm thinking of a particular medieval story, and one of the few medieval stories that I know, of the Pied Piper, and the idea of enchanting people with music and getting them into some kind of trance-like state. Is that connected to this?
I think partially what connects the Pied Piper story with this is one of the things you would do is like, if these people are in your town and they're still tearing it up, you're like, oh, the bagpipe's going that way, guys. Where are they going? And it would be kind of like a way where you're like, all right, we are done. We can't host these people anymore. You kind of like can lead them down the road with music, and they will do that.
Yeah.
Another one of the treatments, like from a social sense too, is be like, and also don't allow music. Be like, nope, sorry, no bagpipes today. Get the hell out of here. Kind of a deal. And we do know that earlier on, there were dancing plagues that were specifically affecting children in the medieval period. So, in 1237, it happens specifically in Erfurt, where 100 or so children are affected very specifically. So kind of together, putting we know that music really draws this out of people. We know that you can use music to ferry these people from one way to another, and there are instances in which case, this means specifically children.
Yeah.
It happens.
See, I think that's so interesting, because in a lot of supernatural stories, especially when we think about poltergeist and possession, it's often children or young people who are seemingly affected. And there's something there about sort of desirability of youth, and also, I guess, the credulity of youth, maybe, that you'll buy into that. And also, I suppose, an element of sort of performatively going against authority, Just thinking about the Pied Piper story as well, and this is bringing like primary school level history knowledge, isn't the story that the Pied Piper steals the children from the town that he's at, but he's there primarily to get rid of rats, is that right?
Yeah.
Which is another interesting plague connection.
Yeah. You are very smart, Maddy.
I'm making all the connections. My primary school education's coming in really handy.
We love this, yeah. But you're absolutely right. So, initially the town is, Hamelin's overrun by rats. They say, come get rid of the rats. He does, and then he's like, now pay me. And they say, haha, sucker.
Okay.
Like, what are you going to do? The rats are gone now. And so he takes the kids.
I mean, slightly
Casual.
extreme.
Yeah.
It's actually petrifying. I used to hate that story as a child.
Yeah, really scary.
Like, he leads them into the side of a mountain or something like that.
Yes.
So as these children are being led away or dancing away in particularly when we're talking in 1233 or the Pied Piper story that we've just been discussing. These are children from all different walks of life, from these particular villages, these towns. What is the class element that we're talking about in terms of this dancing plague?
I mean, this is a really interesting thing for me because the St. John's plague in 1374, it's usually kind of peasants. Right. So people who are from the lower social orders in particular. And, to me, that indicates, these are people who are pretty distressed, especially by, large floods kind of wiping out their livelihood. And also people who are often in real socially structured places where they're not allowed to leave. Right. When you get to the St. Vitus plague, really interestingly, it's townspeople. And we tend to find more cases wherein it's people who have skilled but sedentary jobs.
That's so specific.
Yeah, so it'll be like carpenters.
People who are tied to a workshop or a place and fancy a bit of a break. I guess.
And so they're a little bit more like middle class people, and the thing of it is it never seems to kind of reach the upper echelons. So like nobles don't get the dancing plague. And if they do get the dancing plague, it's like they're notably
they do
kind
it
of like
private,
exactly. They're like, what? Hey, if they want to go to Utrecht, they're going to go to Utrecht. There's no real.
They don't need the excuse of dancing, traveling. Yeah,
and they can dance like whenever if they really feel like it. They can bring some music in and they can just go for it. So it does seem to be people who are from the lower echelons of society, even if it is people who have a bit of cash. If you're a cooper, you've got a pretty good livelihood, you've got a skilled job, but you spend all your day in a warehouse making barrels, and one day you just want to go dance for a while. It's like, well, here's your excuse, right?
There's something there about society being turned upside down, and obviously the medieval world is, and I'm talking in very broad terms here, but it's very structured. It's very organized into these layers of power. And if the people with skills who are making things, they're making money, they're the people who are providing trade, if that class of people starts to misbehave in some way, surely those skills are going to be, not employed where they need to be. There's going to be tools lying dormant. That's going to be a problem for that society, right? So I wonder if there's a kind of, these stories are maybe hyped up in some way because of that anxiety. Is that fair to say in the sources that we've got? I mean, we've gone through a lot of first-hand accounts or writing from this period, but is there a sense that these things are being exaggerated at all?
I mean, I think that especially if we're kind of talking about 14th and 15th centuries, there is a great deal of anxiety about the lower orders kind of losing what their rightful place in the world is, right? So, we're going in through a time when there are multiple peasants' rebellions just all across Europe. We're coming out of the Black Death. Society's really sort of finding what it's going to be. In terms of like what are things now that we have a greatly reduced population. There is much more movement of people generally, because what are you going to do? Come after your 5 surviving serfs when like you and what army? Kind of a deal. Yeah. So there is more ability for this to happen as well because it's more difficult to kind of pursue them. And I mean, I think also one thing that we have to remember is that for medieval people, when they really party, right, when they really get down, a lot of the things that they do are about inversion of social order. Yeah. So, for them, it is absolutely hilarious to be like, got a boy bishop today. Oh, the boy's a bishop.
I'm thinking like mummers plays.
Yeah, mummers plays. Yeah,
like the peasants dressed up as the landlord. And
this is hilarious to them, and it also is how you know that you're having a really good time. So this is kind of like unsanctioned topsy-turviness, right? And it's kind of like it's introducing this mess that they find really pleasurable and enjoyable. But the only way you can kind of get away with it is by being like, I'm tormented. Kind of deal.
Yeah. Are there theories today about why people behave like this?
Yeah, I mean, so there's one that I think is massively unlikely, which is ergotism.
Okay,
and so hear me out on why I think it's massively unlikely. Ergotism is a fairly debilitating sickness, and if you eat, it happens if you eat rye, that's basically gone off.
Oh, so this is the same theory, isn't it, that's applied to the Salem witch trials, where I think I'm right that it's the rye or the crop that's growing nearby supposedly has this mold on it or some kind of bacterial infection, and people consume that and then are hallucinating that they're seeing witches flying, right?
Yeah, but in fact, Puritans are just jerks. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
that's a whole other conversation.
It's like, we really want to get people out of like their bad behavior by saying, I don't know, you ate some weird rye, I'm not buying it. But part of the reason reason why I'm not buying this is, yes, ergotism can produce hallucination or delusions, and it does kind of, say, all right, well, it could happen because your rye got wet during a flooded time. But if that was true, we would see the dancing plague come up in places that are not around the Rhine. We would see it recur in very different places where it doesn't have this particular cultural cachet. Similarly, it is very debilitating, ergotism, and can be fatal. And nobody can dance for several weeks if they have ergotism.
Yeah. Okay. So it's unlikely that this is what's causing it.
It's just like, from a medical standpoint, it would just be incredibly difficult for people to have the stamina to do what it is that they want to do. I do think, for the most part, that it's kind of a mass hysteria.
Yeah.
And mass hysterias
like
exist, And I think partly sometimes some people really do believe it. They really do believe that they are being pulled along. So this isn't to say, if something is a mass hysteria, that the people aren't experiencing it. Right. And we have to be really careful with this, is the distinction there. We can't just say, oh, they were all making it up. I think that there were some people who were, some people who were like, yeah, well, I'm dead, I'm going along with it. Like
a week off work and a holiday to Utrecht.
Yeah, sounds great. But some of them I do think felt as though they had no choice. But, part of probably what is making them feel as though they have no choice is they live in a very communal society. Other people are kind of saying this is happening. They're feeling like, yeah, I don't know, sometimes life sucks and you just got to go for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that we can all kind of relate to, right? So I do kind of think that it is a social malady. Is what I would say, that is really heightened by the circumstances of the medieval and early modern world. This kind of tight structure and control, the fact that you don't have a lot of options in life, and you do see yourself as part of a community that can be affected by this, because it's possible. It's within the realm of historical possibility.
And it's a world that's full of trauma as well, right? We think about the flooding of the Rhine, the plague, actual plague spreading. There's so much trauma, there's so much loss, there's so much horror, and death is very proximate. Your lack of control over your body is something that is evident all the time, and maybe that trauma comes out in a mass hysterical way in this form.
Yeah, I think that's really apt. I think if you do feel yourself to be surrounded by death, you feel your body to be something that is in God's hands, which you're reminded of on a daily basis within these societies, then, it also stands to reason that that could go in a bad direction.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to finish. But before we do fully, I have a question for everybody, and we're going to go one by one. I want to hear everybody's answer. Right. Okay, I'm going to start with producer Charlotte. So she's hiding in the corner and she's suddenly going, oh no. Producer Charlotte, if there was a dancing plague, would you currently dance, or would you be one of the local people going, what are these dancing fools doing? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Oh, she would have danced. So producer Charlotte would have danced. Maddy, dancing or no dancing?
It has to be dancing. I think as long as I'm not falling in any rivers or off any rooftops, a day out from the drudgery of domestic life sounds good.
Okay, Eleanor?
Oh, I'm dancing. Are you joking?
Vibe.
I'm going to Utrecht, baby. Goodbye plowing. That's what's up.
I am at my window, and I'm taking the curtain back.
Oh, you're judging everyone.
And I'm going, these fools are ruining the price of the houses around here.
All right.
You're hiring in the piper to pipe everyone out.
I am doing the piping.
Yeah.
I can't cope with that mess.
Wow.
Wow.
No, we need regulation in this town. We can all dance out that door.
Yeah, I'm 100%, I'll be like, oh, he's at it again. Twitching the lace curtain.
Yeah.
And it would be me. And yeah. Anyway, look, that's just my own annoyance. Listen, Eleanor, thank you so much. One of my favorite things about After Dark is when you think you know something, and then you learn something during the course of the episode that you didn't really know, and it changes your perspective. And that has totally happened with me on this dancing play. I thought I knew from my undergrad days, but actually it's so much more complex and more interesting than what I had remembered. So thank you so much for that.
You know what? It's history at its best, babes.